Thank the gentleman. Let me say, just so everybody knows, this is going to be our last round, and then we'll be done. So we're starting with Mr. Kucinich, and I'll just say to you, I was surprised, Ambassador, you didn't mention the $25,000 rewards for to families involved in suicide bombings.
I did, sir. Okay. Actually, I did in my comments.
Did you also mention Obuni Dao?
I did.
Boy, I'm not paying good enough attention.
I think the record will show I mentioned both of those things.
Okay. Well, I'm happy you did. Okay, Mr. Kucinich.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Mr. Ambassador, in your role as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, can you confirm recent published and broadcast reports that U.S. troops have already or are currently conducting operations inside of Iran?
Congressman Kucinich, I noticed that you mentioned that in your opening remarks and that you made reference to the Seymour Hersh article in the New Yorker, and I'm glad to have an opportunity to respond. I'm not aware of any such operations, and I am in a position, I think, to say that having read the Seymour Hersh article, although not necessarily all the others that you cited, that the description of conversations that he has in the article bears no resemblance whatsoever to any conversation I've ever been in the Department of Defense.
Are U.S. military personnel, have U.S. military personnel or are U.S. military personnel deployed inside and around Iran?
We have military personnel deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq, which are bordering nations. But I am not aware of any operations inside Iran.
Were there operations inside Iran in the last year?
Congressman Kucinich, I'm not aware of any deployment of U.S. troops to Iran.
U.S. military personnel?
Sir, I've already answered the question.
Is that a no? So there's no U.S. military personnel
I'm not aware of
in
anything.
any way, shape, or form?
Not that I'm aware of, sir.
Are they preparing a battlefield by gathering intelligence and recruiting local fighters?
Sir, we have an effort to, in fighting the global war on terror, determine information about terrorists around the world, and I don't think it's appropriate to get into a discussion of that in an open hearing.
Is the U.S. planning and now recruiting members of MEK to conduct lethal operations and destabilizing operations inside Iran?
The only question having to do with the MEK that I'm aware of is that we have a number of them, about 3,000 of them at Camp Ashraf, and we are working with the government of Iraq because Prime Minister Maliki has asked that they no longer be present to figure out how they can be either repatriated to other countries or in some other way no longer in detention in Iraq. And that's the only issue that I'm aware of or have been involved in with the MEK.
Has the Department of Defense already begun hostile actions against Iran, as was the case prior to the Iraq War?
I'm not aware of any hostile actions that we've taken against Iran, sir.
Has the administration already taken the decision to attack Iran?
I'm aware of no decision that's been taken by the President to attack Iran.
Is Congress and the American public now coming under the influence of an orchestrated campaign to take the country into a military conflict against Iran?
Sir, right now the United States government is involved in a very serious diplomatic effort, working with our colleagues among the EU3 and the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council to try and come to grips with the development of Iran's nuclear program, which we believe is a nuclear weapons program, and that is the only activity that I am aware of.
Has the U.S. Strategic Command, supported by the Air Force, drawn up plans at the President's direction for a major bombing campaign in Iran?
Sir, we don't discuss contingency plans, and I would not want my answer to be taken as either a representative of that I'm saying yes or saying no, which is just not an issue we discuss in open public hearings.
I'm going to state that question again. Has the U.S. Strategic Command...
Excuse me, let me just ask the gentleman. I would be very uncomfortable as a chairman of this committee to have someone be discussing the issue as the ambassador answered. Are you looking for another question, or are you just asking him to give the answer that he's already given?
Well, you know, Mr. Chairman, the Department of Defense refused to even attend a classified hearing on this specific issue. We saw the run-up to the war in Iraq. There's quite a similarity here in terms of the way the tracks were laid to go after Iraq and what they're setting up to go after Iran.
No, okay.
Now, you know, I wouldn't even be raising this if this gentleman had shown this committee the courtesy of showing up in a classified meeting.
I was never asked to come to a classified meeting.
Well, you know,
Congressman
somebody
Kucinich.
you work for who's, you know, above your pay grade was.
Well, I understand my colleagues' unhappiness with this. I just want to say that as chairman, I would not want him to answer the question, because I wouldn't want this committee to be into that area. So,
well, I'm going to say, Mr. Chairman, because you know, I don't want to bring this up, but since we're at this point, for years, I refused to sign a statement about divulging classified information, because I'd been to too many classified briefings when I first came to Congress that ended up on the front page of a newspaper, and then I wasn't in a position to talk about it. But in order to hear from the Department of Defense in a classified meeting, at the suggestion and coaxing of the chair, I signed the statement only minutes later to learn that the Department of Defense wasn't showing up. So look, and it was about this question. Has the U.S. Strategic Command, supported by the Air Force, drawn up plans at the President's direction for a major bombing campaign in Iran?
Congressman Kucinich, as I said earlier, the Secretary has said he'd like to arrange an ops intel briefing for the members before they go out, and you know, people can ask questions at that time, but we just don't comment on contingency plans of one sort or another, and as I said earlier, I wouldn't want that to be either taken as either a denial or a confirmation of the premise implicit in your question.
Has the Department of Defense been warned by top-ranking generals that the military's experience in Iraq, where intelligence on weapons of mass destruction was deeply flawed, has affected its approach in Iran?
I'm not aware of such statements, sir.
Do you concede that there are gaps in intelligence with respect to this administration's understanding of the situation on the ground in Iran?
I think we have gaps in intelligence in many matters, including in regard to Iran.
In your judgment, and I'd like the Rear Admiral to answer this as well, would attacking Iran heighten the risk to American forces inside Iraq?
I really think it's inappropriate to address a hypothetical question about an attack that I've already said there's been no decision by the President to make such an attack. So, I just think we're dealing in a realm completely of hypotheticals.
I want everyone to check this out, because the fact of the matter is that all planning for any kind of conflict involves hypotheticals. Now, Admiral, you're a military man. I'm asking you, would attacking Iran heighten risks to American and coalition forces inside Iraq?
It's very difficult to answer without knowing the circumstances, but I think on the face of it, it probably would.
Thank you, Admiral. Ambassador, has the White House been in contact, and that is Mr. Bush and Mr. Cheney, been in contact with the Department of Defense relative to planning for a nuclear attack on Iran?
Sir, as I said, I'm not aware of anything remotely like anything described in the Seymour Hersh article in the New Yorker.
At any time, did the White House insist that a plan for a bombing campaign against Iran include the possible use of a nuclear device to destroy Iran's uranium enrichment plant at Natanz?
I'm not aware of any such thing.
You are a Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And have you been in any discussions regarding a bombing campaign with respect to Iran?
Congressman, I've been involved in a number of discussions about Iran, but most of them have focused on the diplomacy, because that is where the administration's focus is right now.
In your current role as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, are you or anyone within the Department of Defense currently working on, or have they worked on, selecting potential bombing targets in Iran?
Congressman Kucinich, you're essentially asking me the same question you did earlier with regard to contingency plans, and I'm in the same position that I was earlier, which is that I don't think it's appropriate to discuss contingency plans in an open hearing. We don't discuss them in general.
We already know that in the days immediately following 9/11, the Secretary of Defense was advocating a war against Iraq. Now, during your time in the Vice President's office, did you or were you aware of anyone else within the Vice President's office working on military options for Iran?
I'm not aware of anybody in the Vice President's office having worked on military options for Iran.
During the time that you were in that office?
During the time that I was in that office.
Did you see any intelligence relating to Iran during the time that you were in that office?
As I said before, I saw intelligence on any number of different subjects that were part of the normal intelligence briefing that I received every day.
Was it your job to help select the intelligence that would help to make the case for a war against Iraq?
No, sir, it was not.
Whose job was it?
I'm not sure that anybody had such an assignment, sir.
Then how did we get to war against Iraq based on intelligence that you said that you reviewed?
It was the President's decision. Ultimately, it's a presidential decision, sir.
Does the Vice President have anything to do with that based on your role working for the Vice President? Can you share with this committee any of your impressions as to whether the Vice President was involved in that decision?
The Vice President, in my experience, was very careful to provide his advice to the President in private, and many times those of us on the staff were not aware of what that advice specifically was.
Isn't it true that the President generally defers to the Vice President on issues that relate to attacks?
Sir, I think anyone who's actually seen the President and the Vice President interact would not say that the President defers to anybody. The President is the person who makes the decisions for this administration.
Thank you. Do you believe the President must seek authorization from Congress before conducting military operations in Iran?
That's really a legal question, sir, and I'm not in a position to answer that.
Well, you are the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy.
I think it depends very much on what the circumstances are, sir.
Before conducting military operations in Iran?
It would depend on the circumstances.
Under what circumstances should the President of the United States be able to order an attack on Iran without the permission of the Congress?
We're just dealing in such an area of hypothetical, sir. I mean, I believe the President, before we went into combat in Iraq, came to the Congress. He'll make the determination of what the relationship between his administration and Congress ought to be.
Does the U.S. withdrawal out of Iraq impact U.S. military options in Iran?
Again, we're dealing with some very hypothetical questions here. I don't want to, by answering the question, either appear to be confirming or denying the notion that there's some kind of plan to attack Iran, because, as I said, that's a discussion that Mr. Hirsch has had in the New Yorker that I don't believe bears any resemblance to the reality as I know it.
Mr. Chairman, I'll wrap this up. Here's a summary. Hypothetical. Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Hypothetical. Iraq was tied to 9/11. Hypothetical. Saddam Hussein working with al-Qaeda. Hypothetical. Iraq intended to attack the United States. Hypothetical. Iraq had the capacity of attacking the United States. This administration translated every one of those hypotheticals into a course of action that resulted in a disastrous war. Over 2,600 American troops dead, 100 to 200,000 Iraqis dead, the cost of $350 billion or more, maybe $3 trillion, according to Joseph Stiglitz. We're borrowing money from China and Japan to fight a war, all based on hypotheticals. So this gentleman has just laid out a course of response to my questions about Iran, saying, well, that's all hypothetical. Indeed, Mr. Ambassador, it's hypothetical, and we're trying to find out, in our responsibility as a committee, whether or not the very hypotheses that this administration works from are riddled with falsehoods. That's why I asked those questions, and I'm disappointed with your answers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Kucinich, the only thing that I'm aware of that's riddled with falsehoods would be Mr. Hirsch's story in the New Yorker.
Well, when you raise your right hand under penalty of perjury in an open committee where you answer questions without shielding yourself behind the rubric of classified information, then I'll be ready to take your word for it.